Hello from ABA Tech Show 2018 in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Laurence Colletti.
Stanley Louissaint.
And we're on the road with Legal Talk Network. And we're back. We're at the wonderful Hyatt Regency here. I think this is the magnificent mile. We're opening up our coverage of ABA Tech Show 2018. I have a return guest, Stanley Louissaint. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you were like fresh done from your presentation here, and it was titled Backup and Disaster Recovery DIY or Buy.
Yes. Very interesting topic.
Well, you picked like the right year to do this topic, I think. I mean, with all the hurricanes, storms, fires, mudslides that have been going on in the continental United States, people have a lot to think about.
Well, you know what's interesting is there's never bad timing with this, right? This is one of those things that is going to go on forever and ever, and it's always going to be a question. And naturally, I just want to tell you, which is interesting, the natural disasters only account for 10% of the errors that would cause you to need backup and disaster recovery.
So we don't even think about biblical disasters, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse stop by your office. You don't have to worry about that. That day probably won't come, and even if it does, most of the time it's going to be something not a natural disaster that's causing you to lose your data, your client information, and whatnot.
100%. Human error.
Well, let's get into that. So really interesting, the DIY, of course, which is short for do it yourself or buy. So that's interesting because I would imagine, we're here at ABA Tech Show, and from my understanding, and I could be wrong, but my understanding is a lot of the people here in attendance are small firms and solos, and so those are the kind of people, the kind of lawyers that tend to do things themselves, the DIY. But let's talk about the DIY or buy part.
So one of the things, just so you know, so we talked about backup and disaster recovery, right? Which is very interesting because backup and disaster recovery are two separate things, right? Even though we tend to bundle them as one. So you can have backup and not disaster recovery, and have disaster recovery and not have backup. So backup and disaster recovery, or a BDR, is essentially a melding of the two worlds. So you're covered in all entities. So I just think that's an important point to make. One of the interesting things about the prepackaged or do it yourself, which is, do you buy a solution that's already made, fully integrated, you plug it in and you go? Or do you say, you know what, I don't want to pay that vendor those fees, I don't want to keep paying this monthly recurring that they're charging me, and I decide I'm going to take it into my own hands and do it myself? So it's definitely an interesting dichotomy between the two schools, and it's all about how much risk you're willing to take.
Okay, I got you. And so I can't imagine that as a busy practitioner that you want to go down the DIY route. It seems like you're opening yourself up for much more risk, much more trouble, and you're kind of basically reinventing the wheel.
Yes. Not only are you reinventing the wheel, you're trying to find out what pieces go on to make the wheel, right? In a way, right? Because when you buy a prepackaged solution, what does that mean? That means everything's been done for you. The thought is out. Like, you just take and go, right? Imagine building your own car. It's the same thing when you do DIY, right? You got to figure out what components are going to go in to do what you need them to do. And then at the end, right, there's theory, and then there's what actually happens. So you're going to have to go through all those things yourself. But if you're up for the challenge, no one's stopping you. Go for it.
Well, backup and recovery, the two sections of data here that you were talking about. Let's try to leave the listeners with some great resources. I'd like to make this podcast of value, reward the listener for tuning in. So before you get to your disaster day, whatever disaster that happens to be, the data backup part, not the recovery, but the data backup part, what services are you recommending?
Okay, so we work with, any IT provider that you work with, including ourselves, has those solutions built in. And what we're talking about is a BDR, which essentially is an appliance that's on site. So you're not talking about like Carbonite or Mozy, where you're just doing a cloud-based backup. You're talking about actually having a physical device on your location so that if your server goes offline, you can fail over to that server. So, put that recovery side to the side, but you actually have something on your site. So you would actually get that through an IT provider. Most of the companies that actually have the prepackaged solutions won't sell it to an end user directly. So whether you're working with someone like me, or someone like me, that's your options in terms of, hey, let's get me a BDR device.
So in terms of that, whether it's a product, whether it's a service, whether it's a piece of equipment, what kinds of questions as a lawyer should they be asking? So if you're dealing with one of these vendors, like kind of an FAQ, frequently asked questions, or recommended frequently asked questions, what are you telling some people?
You definitely always want to be empowered, right? So the first thing you're going to ask is, number one is, what's the back end that they're using? Meaning, whose device are they reselling? Did they build their own, or are they using one of the trusted players in the industry already, right? And like I said, those players don't go after end users, so it's no problem disclosing it because you want to let people know what that strategic partnership is. So number one is who they're using. Number two is, do they have multiple data centers? Because one of the rules around backups is you want to make sure that those things are in more than one place. So if that provider has an issue at one location, your stuff is also at another location. And then, of course, you want to know is, what's my contract term, right? What am I locked into? What are you responsible for? What am I responsible for? Because if you're just utilizing these guys for one service, there might be some things that are not covered in the event catastrophe does happen that you might have to pay for after the fact. So, ask them what they cover, what they're willing to do if you have a disaster, what they're going to do for you versus not do for you, or that's included in the price.
In my career, I've encountered some of this where, we were trying to back up some data, and one of the things that I felt was useful, if you've got the budget, was to maybe, even after you hire your vendor or your service that is going to be backing up your data, to maybe think about periodically checking in with a different vendor, just to see that everything's being done correctly, see it from a different vantage point. Is that some of the things that you recommend?
Yeah, there's never anything wrong with auditing, right? Because you don't know what you don't know, and what happens a lot of times is you're paying someone to actually provide a service for you that you, in a way, know nothing about, right? You're under the assumption that everything is working like it's supposed to, and we can go down the list of different things that you do that with. But I've had situations in the past where I've audited folks, and I found that the things weren't working, as they thought it was. So yeah, you always want to check in and make sure that that's happening.
Recovery. So the bad day has come. Now you got to go find your data again. And so just kind of similar question that I asked during the backup process here. It's already happened. You're looking for your data. Is there some frequently asked questions that you recommend? To try to provide immediate value to our listeners here. What services should they be looking to? What questions should they be asking?
So remember, when you're talking about recovery, you've already engaged into your backup vendor, right? So now it's time to actually go and put this stuff into motion on the other side of pulling the data back. So what you're going to do is, number one is, hey, you should have been backing up at the shortest interval possible, right? So how much did I lose, right? That's the thing, because you're going to lose something, right? And the question is, how much of it did I lose? So if you were working on a document at 1:15 p.m. and your last backup was from 1 o'clock, you're probably going to lose 15 minutes, right? So you want to know that. Number two is, how do we prevent this from happening again, right? Because there's an incident that occurred that caused you to have that data loss. And then number three is, all right, let's make sure that the backups are restored and working again to continue backing up from this point forward.
So in our pregame, as we were discussing during the sound check, you had mentioned that you put together a calculator to help people figure out sort of, is it the value of time lost, or is it sort of like a reverse break even? How does it work? So
this is pretty much called a recovery time objective or recovery point objective. And what those things are doing for you is helping you calculate, A, how much downtime you can afford if your servers are actually offline, or B, how much information you can lose before you start losing money. And there's a few different things that are taken into the calculator, including how many servers you have, how much you're paying your employees, what's your company overhead, and that stuff will help you to understand what your actual tolerance level is. Because one of the things that you find out is people say, oh, we could be down for a day, it's no problem, we can lose data for a day. And if that actually happens, it's like D-Day, right? Or you show them the numbers, like, hey, you're paying 50 people, you're paying them each, $10 an hour, you do the math on what you're losing for every hour that you're down, and all of a sudden, everything is different.
In the spirit of providing immediate value to the listener, how can they find that calculator to help them?
Yeah, you can find that calculator on our website, which is fluiddesigns.com/ABA. So FLUIDDESIGNS.com/ABA, and it'll be there for your use.
Oh, well, Stanley, I just got one last question. If our listeners, they want to reach out, talk to you about some of the things we've discussed here, how can they find you?
Easiest man in America to find, right? I said that to you last time. So you can, phone number is 908-688-2444. Email address is SLOUISSAINT fluiddesigns.com, FLUIDDESIGNS.com. And then LinkedIn, just search Stanley Louissaint. You'll find me there. And Twitter is Fluid Designs Inc., so I'm all over. You Google me, you'll find me.
Let's hit that calculator one more time, too.
So that calculator is fluiddesigns.com/ABA.
Excellent. Well, we've reached the end of the road for today's episode, but I want to thank our guests for joining us. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And if you like what you heard today, please find us and rate us in Apple Podcasts. We'll see you next time for another episode of On the Road with Legal Talk Network.
If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, please visit LegalTalkNetwork.com. Subscribe via iTunes and RSS. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, or download our free Legal Talk Network app in Google Play and iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.